The Three Snake Leaves. Once there was a poor man who couldn't support his own son any more. When the son realized this, he said, "Father, it's no use my staying here. I'm just a burden to you. I'm going to leave home and see if I can earn a living." The father gave him his blessing and they parted sorrowfully. The king of a nearby country was a powerful ruler, and at that time he was waging war. The young man enlisted in his army and soon found himself at the front, where a great battle was being fought. The bullets flew like hail. The danger was hideous, and his comrades were falling dead all around. When the general himself fell dead, the last of the troops were going to flee, but the young man took his place and yelled, "We won't be defeated. Follow me, and God save the king." The men followed him as he led the charge, and they soon had the enemy on the run. When the king heard of the young man's part in the victory, he promoted him to field marshal, gave him gold and treasure, and bestowed on him the highest honors in the kingdom. Now the king had a daughter who was very beautiful, but she had one strange obsession. She had sworn an oath not to marry any man unless he promised to let himself be buried alive with her if she died first. "After all, if he really loves me," she said, "why would he want to go on living?" And she said that she would do the same and be buried with him if he was the first to die. This grim condition had put off many young men who would otherwise have begged to marry her, but the soldier was so struck by her beauty that nothing would discourage him. So he asked the king for her hand. "Do you know what you must promise?" said the king. "If she dies before me, I must go to the grave with her," said the soldier. "But I love her so much that I'm willing to risk that." The king consented, and the wedding was celebrated with great splendor. For a while they lived together happily, but one day the princess fell ill. Doctors came from all over the kingdom, but none of them could help her, and presently she died. And then the young soldier remembered the promise he'd had to make, and shuddered. There was no way of getting out of it, even if he'd wanted to break the promise, because the king was going to put sentries at the grave itself, and all around the cemetery, in case he tried to escape. When the day came for the princess to be buried, they carried her body to the royal vault, made sure the young man was inside, and the king personally locked and bolted the door. They had put some provisions in there. On a table there were 4 candles, 4 loaves of bread, and 4 bottles of wine. The soldier sat there beside the princess's body, day after day, taking only a mouthful of bread and a sip of wine, making them last as long as possible. When he'd taken the last sip, but one, and eaten the last mouthful, but one, and when the last candle was down to its last inch, he knew that his time had nearly come. But as he sat there in despair, he saw a snake crawl out of a corner of the vault and move towards the body. Thinking it intended to eat her, the young man drew his sword. "While I live, you shan't touch her," he said, and struck the snake 3 times, cutting it to pieces. Shortly afterwards, a second snake came crawling out of the corner. It came to the body of the first snake and looked at it, piece by piece, and then crawled away again. Soon it came back, and this time it had 3 green leaves in its mouth. Carefully moving the first snake's body together again, it laid a leaf on each of the wounds, and in a moment the dead snake stirred into life. The wounds closed up, and it was whole again. The 2 snakes hurried away together, but the leaves were still lying where they'd left them, and the young man thought that if their miraculous power had brought the snake back to life, it might do the same for a human being. So he picked up the leaves and laid them on the dead princess's white face, one on her mouth and the other 2 on her eyes. And as soon as he did this, her blood began to stir. A healthy pink came into her cheeks, and she drew a breath and opened her eyes. "God in heaven," she said, "where am I?" "You're with me, my dear wife," said the soldier, and told her all that had happened. He gave her the very last mouthful of bread and the very last sip of wine, and then they banged on the door and shouted so loudly that the sentries outside heard them and went running to the king. The king came to the graveyard himself and personally unlocked and unbolted the door of the vault. The princess tumbled into his arms. He shook the young man's hand, and everyone rejoiced at the miracle that had brought her back to life. As for the snake leaves, the soldier was a careful man, and he told no one about how the princess had been revived. But he had an honest and reliable servant, so he gave the servant the 3 snake leaves to look after. "Take good care of them," he said, "and make sure you keep them with you wherever we go. You never know when we might need them again." Now, after she was brought back to life, a change came over the princess. All the love she had for her husband drained away from her heart. She still pretended to love him, however, and when he suggested making a sea voyage to visit his old father, she agreed at once. "What a pleasure it'll be to meet the noble father of my dearest husband," she said. But once at sea, she forgot the great devotion the young man had shown her, because she felt a lust growing in her for the captain of the ship. Nothing would satisfy her but to sleep with him, and soon they were lovers. One night in his arms she whispered, "Oh, if only my husband were dead, what a marriage we two would make!" "That is easily arranged," said the captain. He took a length of cord, and, with the princess at his side, crept into the cabin where the young man was sleeping. The princess held one end of the cord, and the captain wound the other around her husband's neck, and then they pulled so hard that, struggle as he might, he couldn't fight them off, and soon they had strangled him. The princess took her dead husband by the head, and the captain took him by the feet, and they threw him over the ship's rail. "Let's go home now," said the princess. "I'll tell my father that he died at sea, and I'll sing your praises, and he'll let us be married, and you can inherit the kingdom." But the faithful servant had seen everything they'd done, and as soon as their backs were turned, he untied a boat from the ship and rowed back in search of his master's body. He soon found it, and after hauling it into the boat, he untied the cord from around the young man's neck and put the 3 snake leaves on his eyes and mouth, and he came back to life at once. Then the two of them rowed with all their might. Day and night they rowed, stopping for nothing, and their boat flew over the waves so fast that they reached the shore a day before the ship and went straight to the palace. The king was amazed to see them. "What happened?" he said. "Where's my daughter?" They told him everything, and he was shocked to hear of his daughter's treachery. "I can't believe she'd do such a terrible thing," he said, "but the truth will soon come to light." And so it did. Very soon the ship arrived at the port, and on hearing of this, the king made the young man and his servant wait in a hidden room, where they could listen to everything that was said. The princess, dressed all in black, came sobbing to her father. "Why have you come back alone?" he said. "Where's your husband? And why are you wearing mourning?" "Oh, father dear," she said, "I'm inconsolable. My husband took ill with the yellow fever and died. The captain and I had to bury him at sea. If he hadn't helped me, I don't know what I would have done. But the captain's such a good man. He looked after my dear husband when the fever was at its height. No matter what the danger, he can tell you all about it." "Oh, your husband's dead, is he?" said the king. "Let's see if I can bring him back to life." And he opened the door and invited the other two to come out. When the princess saw the young man, she fell to the ground as if she'd been struck by lightning. She tried to say that her husband must have been hallucinating in his fever, that he must have fallen into a coma so deep they mistook it for death. But the servant produced the cord, and in the face of that evidence, she had to admit her guilt. "Yes, we did it," she sobbed, "but please, father, show some mercy." "Don't speak to me of mercy," said the king. "Your husband was ready to die in the grave with you, and he gave you back your life, but you killed him in his sleep. You'll get the punishment you deserve." and she and the captain were put on board a ship with holes drilled in the hull and sent out over the stormy sea. Soon they sank with the ship and were never seen again. Wow, I've never heard that story before. As interesting, interesting. Uh, so Philip Pullman says about it. He says similar stories are Italo Calvino, the captain and the general, and the lion's grass. And he says it's a vivid and intriguing tale which falls into two halves, the first half being magic and the second romantic and realistic. The version in Grimm ties both halves together skillfully by means of the leaves in the title. I haven't altered it apart from the business of the young man's murder. In the original, he's just thrown over the side of the ship. But in the two similar tales in Calvino, the hero is executed by firing squad in the first case and on the gallows in the second, and is thus incontrovertibly dead before being brought back to life by means of the magic leaves. I thought that the young man in this story ought to be unmistakably and dramatically killed, too, hence the strangling, which also allows the servant to prove the wife's guilt by producing the cord. But into how many pieces is the snake cut? This vital question seems to have foxed everyone, including the Grimms themselves. The text has unequivocally und halb sie in drei Stück and cut into three pieces. And David Luke, Ralph Mannheim, and Jack Zipes all leave that as it is in their translations of the story. Yet to do that would only take 2 blows of the young man's sword, and consequently there would be only 2 places to put the leaves, not 3. We need to look at what's essential, and what's essential is the number 3. The 3 leaves, the princess's eyes and mouth, the classic fairy tale 3. So there need to be 3 places for the second snake to put the leaves. Hence there need to be 3 blows of the sword, which would cut the snake not into 3, but into 4. But to say that introduces the idea of 4 unhelpfully into the reader's or listener's mind. I think the best solution is what I've done above. All right. I'm going to read one more. I'll try to do something kind of short. And maybe I haven't heard it before. No, not Cinderella. How about the riddle? The riddle. Once there was a prince who took it into his head to travel about the world, taking no one with him but a faithful servant. One day they came to a great forest, and when evening came, they could find no place to shelter. They didn't know where they could spend the night. But then the prince saw a little house, and walking towards the house there was a girl, and as they came closer they saw that she was young and beautiful. He caught up with her and said, "Tell me, miss, can my servant and I find shelter for the night in that little house?" "Yes," she said sadly, "you can, but I don't think it's a good idea. I wouldn't go in if I were you." "Why ever not?" asked the prince. The girl sighed. "My stepmother lives there," she said, "and she practices the evil arts. What's more, she doesn't like strangers. But if you must go in, don't eat or drink anything she offers you." The prince realized that this was the house of a witch, but it was dark, and they couldn't go any further, and besides he was afraid of nothing, so he knocked and went in. The old woman was sitting in an armchair by the fire, and when she looked at the prince, her eyes glowed like the coals. "Good evening, young sirs," she said in her friendliest voice. "Sit down and rest yourselves." She blew on the fire and stirred something in a little pot. Because of the girl's warning, the prince and his servant didn't eat or drink anything. They wrapped themselves up and slept soundly till morning. When morning came, they got ready to leave. The prince was already mounted on his horse when the old woman came out and said, "Wait a minute, just let me give you a little drink to see you on your way." While she went back into the house, the prince rode away. but the servant had to tighten the girth of his saddle, and he was still there when the witch came out with the drink. "Here you are," she said. "Take this to your master." But he had no time to do that, because as soon as he took it from her hand, the glass burst, and the drink splashed onto his horse. It was poison, of course, and it was so strong that the poor animal fell dead at once. The servant ran after the prince and told him what had happened, and he'd have left with the prince right there and then, except that he didn't want to abandon his saddle. So he went back to get it. When he reached the dead horse, he found a raven already perching on its head and pecking out its eyes. "Who knows? We might find nothing better to eat today," he thought. So he killed the raven and took it with him. They wandered in the woods all day long, but they couldn't find their way out. As night fell, they came to an inn, and the servant gave the raven to the innkeeper and told him to prepare it for their supper. Now, what they didn't know was that they'd fallen into a den of brigands, murderers, in fact, and just as the prince and his servant were sitting down, 12 of these rascals turned up, meaning to do away with them. But seeing the supper arrive, the murderers thought they might as well eat first. It was the last meal they ever had, for they hadn't swallowed more than a mouthful of the raven stew when they all fell dead. The poison in the horse had been so strong that it had passed on to the raven, and that had been enough to kill every one of them. The innkeeper had fled, seeing what had happened, and there was no one left in the house but the innkeeper's daughter. She was a good girl, and had had nothing to do with the murderers and their wickedness. She unlocked a hidden door and showed the prince all the treasure they'd stolen, piles of gold and silver, and mounds of jewels. The prince said she could keep it for herself. He wanted nothing to do with it. And once again he and his servant rode on their way. They traveled about for a long time, and one day they came to a town where there was a princess who was both very beautiful and very proud. She had announced that she would marry any man who asked her a riddle that she couldn't solve. However, she managed to solve it to the satisfaction of 12 wise riddle masters. His head would be cut off. She would have 3 days to think about it, but she was so clever that she always solved it long before that time was up. Already 9 men had tried to beat her, but each of them had lost his head. However, that didn't worry the prince. He was so dazzled by her great beauty that he was willing to risk his life. He went to the palace and asked his riddle. "One killed none," he said, "but still killed 12. What is it?" She had no idea what it could be. She thought and thought, but nothing came to mind. She consulted all her riddle books, but there had been nothing like it in all the history of riddles. It seemed as if she'd met her match at last. However, she wasn't willing to give up, so that night she sent her chambermaid to creep quietly into the prince's bedroom. There she had to listen carefully to anything he said in his sleep, in case he revealed the answer to the riddle in his dreams. But that came to nothing, because the prince's servant had taken his place, and when the maid came in, he snatched away the robe she'd covered herself with and chased her away with a stick. So that didn't work. On the second night, she sent another maid to see if she'd be any more successful. His servant took her robe as well and chased her away with an even bigger stick. So that didn't work either. On the third night, the prince decided to wait and watch himself. This time, the princess came herself. She was wearing a beautiful mist-gray robe, and she sat down softly on the bed next to him and waited till she was sure he was asleep. But he was still awake, and when she whispered, "One killed none. What is that?" he answered, "A raven ate the flesh of a horse that was poisoned and died itself." Then she said, "But still killed 12. What does that mean?" He answered, 12 murderers ate a stew made from the raven and died of it." She was sure she had the answer now, and she tried to tiptoe away, but the prince caught hold of her robe and held it so tight that she had to leave it behind. Next morning the princess announced that she had solved the riddle. She sent for the 12 riddle masters and told them what it meant. It looked as if the prince was doomed, but he asked to be heard. "The princess came into my room when she thought I was asleep," he said, "and asked me what the answer was. She would never have guessed it otherwise. The riddle masters conferred together and said, "Have you any proof?" Then the prince's servant brought in the 3 robes. When the riddle master saw the mist gray one, which no one but the princess ever wore, they said, "Have this robe embroidered with gold and silver, your highness, for it will be your wedding gown. The young man has won." That's it. All right. Well, it's worth a try.